Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center in the second day of our Climate Change Politics in North America conference. My name is Jeff DeBelko, Director of the Environmental Change and Security Program, and on behalf of my colleague David Biet, the Canada Institute, we want to welcome you to what has already been a lively discussion and an excellent set of panel presentations yesterday and a very stimulating conversation with all of you. So we look forward to continuing that this morning. And I think we'll just jump straight to it. We have three presentations here this morning on policy-making leadership in states, provinces, and by individuals. We're going to start with Barry Rabe from the University of Michigan talking about second-generation climate policies in the states, proliferation, diffusion, and regionalization. Then we'll go to Susie Moser from the National Center for Atmospheric Research talking about communicating about climate and motivating citizen action. And finally, Andrew Alisi from the World Resources Institute has agreed to be a discussant. Stacy VanDeveer was just telling me about how WRI is doing quite a bit of work on assessing state initiatives, and with some reports coming out here later in the summer. So we're looking forward to those and perhaps getting an advanced preview from some of the insights from that process. So I'd like to turn it over to Barry and look forward to his presentation.
Thank you, and good morning. I'd just like to begin by thanking the folks from the Wilson Center and Stacy and Henrik for all their work in pulling this together. I've had the opportunity to participate in conferences on both sides of the 49th parallel dealing with climate issues, but increasingly as we see the interrelationships between the two, I think this is a relatively unique gathering, but I think the kind of thing that will be taking place more and more. Obviously a lot of thought went into it, and so we are really in your debt, so thank you. There were a couple of presentations yesterday that touched upon different aspects of the American state experience. I don't want to replicate that. I think they were very much on point, but I'll stand behind my paper and perhaps modify my remarks so as not to duplicate what's already been covered. As I think was made clear in several presentations and several comments yesterday, it is safe to say that if one looks at the U.S. as a federal system and its state units, climate policy looks a lot differently than one sees when one looks at the national level. I spent the day before this conference at US EPA, where there's a certain tension and uneasy question of the relationship between federal and state, a topic that we'll probably be touching upon significantly. And we'll just begin by saying that it is all the familiar states. It is California. It is New York. It is Massachusetts. But we're beginning to see a broader and more diverse subset of states get into the game of developing climate and climate policy tools. Why? Some of this was touched upon already quickly. States already have considerable powers, regulatory powers and taxing powers in areas that are directly relevant to areas of activity that influence greenhouse gas development. I think we are also seeing increasingly in a large number of states a framing of the issue that is a little different. It's one thing to talk about climate change through a UN report or an Al Gore movie or Time magazine. It's a little different when you're in Alaska and trucks start going through the tundra, or you're in Tallahassee where there is literally a bill sitting on Governor Bush's desk this morning creating a Florida Climate Change Commission, which apparently he's going to sign, that's driven by coastal and other kinds of concerns. The issue presents itself a little differently when you look at state by state or region by region differences, and climate policy or climate impacts don't become some ethereal discussion of temperature, although that's a hugely important one, but might be manifest in more immediate kinds of considerations. Then there's the economic development issue. And one theme that I do want to develop that was not heavily emphasized yesterday is that as I've observed a wide range of state initiatives, both early stage activities earlier in this decade and more recently, I would say that not all of them have specifically talked about greenhouse gases or climate change. In some cases, there's little, if any, reference to greenhouse gas impacts. In some cases, it's very upfront and explicit. But a common theme emerging in almost all of them is perceived economic impacts, either no economic impacts or perceived economic benefits. Alex Farrell's no longer here, but it's intriguing to look at one of the underlying rationales for California to take its steps, all of the steps, is a robust economic analysis arguing that all of these actions, these proposed actions, would be good economically for the state of California. Now that's a debatable proposition, just as in David's discussions of the corporate sector yesterday, questions of sort of corporate transformation and decarbonization, does that have payoffs or not, whether we're talking about BP or other entities. But it is safe to say that in many, many, many state capitals, climate policy has been sold to legislatures and to constituents as an economic development concern. And it's very interesting to now begin to look 2, 3, 5 years into some of these policies as to whether that's going to play out or not. I also just wanted to touch quickly in terms of drivers behind this, the point that Stacy raised yesterday in terms of policy entrepreneurship. We clearly see in a large number of states infrastructure development, putting together policy capacity so that when it comes time to talk about renewable energy and renewable energy credits, or cap and trade, or the tools and nuts and bolts of policies, one can go to places like Springfield and Hartford, Connecticut, and Salem, and lots of other state capitals, and basically see in place an infrastructure for how one might do climate policy. I actually think that's a significant difference from states and provinces, where one can look at a large number of provinces, and with a few notable exceptions, there hasn't been that development and the creation of opportunities for policy entrepreneurs to work. And in turn, and this emerged in the Reggie discussion yesterday, there are clearly at least some state activities that are expressly designed to push the federal government, to embarrass, to push the federal government to take steps in action, although that's a subset of the larger pieces of policies. So those are some of the drivers, some of them new, some of them not so new. In my paper, I try to focus a lot on trends, this notion of a second generation, if you will, of climate policy, and quickly just want to touch upon 3 areas that I see. However we might try to quantify this, the number of states that are doing something related to greenhouse gas reductions continues to grow and to diversify. The sheer number of policies continues to grow, and the raising of the bar takes place. In many cases, states that in 1999 passed an initial policy, now going back and setting more ambitious targets, either for emission reductions or moving toward renewable energy or what have you. I think it's safe to say that we might debate the number, but there's a fairly reasonable subset of states that if you could somehow helicopter them out of North America, and I'm not proposing this as a federalism strategy, but deposit them in the European Union, at the very week where we have begun to wonder about the effectiveness and viability of the European trading system, and really begin to wonder in the nations of the European Union how much climate policy capacity, that entrepreneurial issue again, has really been developed, given the mess up in the permit allocation scheme and other pieces. There are a large number of states that you could deposit in the European Union, and they would basically be ready to play in the ETS. They would basically be able to play in the climate policy game. So that's one piece, proliferation. A second is diffusion, sort of classic American federalism. One might look at renewable energy mandates, or so-called portfolio standards. I know Ian Rollins will be talking much more about renewable energy as we go forward. The RPS is a fairly simple and straightforward tool that mandates a certain amount or percentage of electricity that must be provided by electricity providers in a jurisdiction over a designated period of time. It's a tool that's used in multiple continents. If we had been gathering here 2 years ago, 13 states had renewable portfolio standards. If we had gathered last year at this time, it would be 18 states. As of now, unless something happened last night, there are 22 states in the District of Columbia. A presidential candidate in 2008 winning only states with RPSs would handily win in the Electoral College. 16 of these 22 laws were passed, signed into law by Republican governors. And yes, it's the more traditional sort of bi-coastal coalition, but also a constellation of states that include Texas, Montana, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Illinois. Some are big carbon states, and there are complexities in these RPSs that we might talk about, but are interesting to think about. Here, a key driver has been the argument of economic development, the idea of homegrown energy, as opposed to importing non-domestic sources of natural gas, oil, which is still burned in a number of states to small degrees, even uranium. Why not sort of capture those jobs internally? That's the argument that's advanced in many state capitals. And we're beyond the stage at early RPS development where we were talking about a percentage or 2 or 3. Amongst recent laws, some of which were revamped in the last year or so, Nevada's pledged to be at 20% renewable energy by 2015. Texas, which uses more electricity and generates more greenhouse gases than all of Canada, has had a very robust RPS, which was signed initially into law by then Governor Bush in 1999. His successor, Governor Perry, last summer in a special session of the Texas legislature basically doubled the goal. Texas is pledged to be somewhere around 7 or 8% renewable energy, primarily wind, by 2015. New York, 25% by 2013. Pennsylvania, 18% by 2020. Not sure we're going to get to those numbers, but we're talking about big numbers, which in turn changes much of the dynamic. So we're seeing a certain kind of diffusion. Again, classic federalism, where what starts in one state ultimately is replicated and picked up in other areas. Then there's this issue of regionalism. We had a nice conversation yesterday about RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, but there are other ways in which this is beginning to emerge formally or otherwise. We're seeing a number of states enter into bilateral conversations and agreements, Arizona and New Mexico. The idea of, in effect, a two-pronged strategy for regulating tailpipe emissions related to carbon, where you have an interesting coalition that involves not just California, Washington, Oregon, and at least 8 other northeastern states, given the unique nature of the way clean air emissions policy has been established in the U.S. But then you have de facto regional issues as well. There is, in effect, a regional renewable portfolio mandate that starts in California, runs all the way through Texas, and with a couple of gaps goes all the way up to Montana. That's a zone that uses a lot of electricity, generates a lot of greenhouse gases, but in effect, a set of state to state to state policies that in effect do the same thing, but raise all kinds of questions of interstate coordination, as well as how individual states capture benefits and export varying kinds of problems. So you have all of these policies, and just quickly, there are a couple of other pieces I just wanted to touch upon that are relatively new. We have now seen precedent whereby, among other things, ballot propositions are being used to move forward climate policy initiatives. Colorado tried 3 times to pass a renewable energy mandate, failed, went to a ballot proposition, and by a vote of the people of Colorado 2 years ago, Colorado has an RPS. It's immediately triggered interest in a number of other states about using direct democracy provisions, which are used in a number of environmental and other areas as well. And then there are other players. Attorneys General. Attorneys General in the U.S., for those of you from the Canadian side, are for the most part elected on a partisan basis. They have aggressive powers. They are highly ambitious. 40% of all attorneys general ultimately run for the governorship of their state. Think Bill Clinton. Think Eliot Spitzer. And there are an awful lot of state attorney generals running around these days, including states like North Carolina, which we tend not to think of climate pioneers, looking at ways to sue or to litigate, either pressing the federal government or pressing corporations, and in some cases working with another elected official in many states, state treasurers, elected officials who not only sort of move around budgets, but control pension funds and can pursue climate-friendly investments. I think an interesting point, I wish Alex were here to discuss it, is the battle underway in California to claim the most political credit for leadership on climate policy. Is it the renounced Gray Davis, who did sign the Pavley bill? Is it the well-known current governor? Is it his most likely Democratic challenger in the next election, the state treasurer of that state? Is it Senator Pavley? Is it Senator Bowen, who's seeking statewide office? And on it goes. So one sees, I think, a fairly diverse and robust set of activities. There are clear constraints and clear limits on it, There are some regions, particularly the southeastern United States, which are not significant players yet at all, and one really does see a kind of a patchwork quilt here. But looking ahead, what are some of the issues? Again, I think in some respects, I talked about Europe earlier. As I begin to look at the U.S., I'm struck by how much the U.S. is beginning to look not so much like Canada, but more like the European Union. Yes, Europe has ratified Kyoto. Yes, there's an emissions trading system. But if you look at the 15 or now 25 members of the European Union and look at other policies independent of ETS, like renewable portfolio mandates, it really is a patchwork quilt. You have some nations that are big players, some nations that are not, and some governments that shift policies. Look at the shift in politics in Germany, or the likely coming shift in the United Kingdom, the two sort of moral superpowers of climate policy in the European Union, and a real possibility that we'll see significant shifts in energy and climate-related policies in both of those countries, as well as the challenge the British have to explain why all of these coal companies or natural gas companies are making windfall profits because they got too many allocations given the screw-up of the European trading system mechanism. I don't mean to come here as the Americans sort of casting aspersions on my European counterparts, but just as the Europeans have a really mixed federal kind of a system for climate, so does the United States, for better or for worse. Secondly, I would argue, in addition to the sort of sheer proliferation of policies, one is seeing a change in the way politics, climate politics, are playing out at the state level. It wasn't that long ago that this really was a fairly quiet, consensual, intra-agency driven process. Fairly quiet, fairly collaborative, a lot of voluntary strategies, relatively low-hanging fruit. Who could argue with it? One now begins to see some real turf and interest group issues. If one looks at the networks of people who come to state legislative hearings, who testify, the list becomes longer. The stakes are greater. There's more money at stake. There's more percentages of renewable energy. In my work with the Pew Center on renewable portfolio standards, it's absolutely fascinating to look at how the politics of renewable portfolio standards differ in 2004 and 2005 from 1990 and 2000. When you start talking about 7, 8, 10, 20, 25, in California, 33% coming from renewable energy, that's a lot of energy. That's a lot of money. And you're pitting competing interests against one another. Conventional generators versus renewables, an interesting dynamic where there's real squabbling between renewable energy proponents. Wind has been a net winner in many states. Solar has lagged behind because of cost competitiveness. And in some states, the solar proponents holding their breath and saying, we are not going to support a renewable energy mandate unless there is a special provision, a special benefit, or a set-aside. And so as you begin to look at the timetables and the provisions and all the tiers, they become ever more complex. And this becomes a very, very intensive area of interest group politics. You have competition amongst environmental advocacy groups. Who gets to the table? Who has influence? Who gets to have input onto policy? Should it be cap and trade? Or, as the latest Pavley bill suggests, cap, because trade is offensive? That's a battle to be waged. Again and again one sees it. Which consultants get invited in? Which consultants get the contract? And which do not? Which state universities get subsidies to do research? Which don't? It's a very, very interesting area, and I think we're beginning to see some of the qualities of classic distributional politics emerge amongst the states. Finally, I think this raises some intriguing questions of federalism and intergovernmental relations. On the one hand, hovering over all of this is, at what point does the federal government begin to push back? Yes, joining in litigation in all likelihood against the California vehicle bill. But at what point might the federal government try to preempt states that are seen as trying to capture economic development benefits by discriminating against commerce, electricity generated in other parts of the country? One can look at a number of the renewable portfolio standards and see how states have created, in effect, an uneven playing field. In some states, if you generate the electricity within your state boundaries, you get a bonus credit. Well, how does that fare given interstate commerce? There are some states, including the legislation that former Governor Bush signed as governor of Texas, that clearly discriminate against electricity generated outside of Texas. Why? Because Texas wants to capture the economic benefit from what's being billed as an economic development strategy. So there are all kinds of potential constitutional and political issues as well, and some interesting interstate tensions. There are also questions, I think, about how well some of these regional entities can hold together. Again, I support everything that was said yesterday about RGGI. I think what we know less about, and the folks at RGGI have focused less about, is how when you have this kind of Noah's Ark effect, where you have the lead energy and environment officials from these 8 or 10 states meeting together quietly for 3 years and trying to develop the one best system for cap and trading for the Northeast, what happens when you bring in organized interests? What happens when a governor pulls out? What happens given power asymmetries? This process has been driven largely by the state of New York. As the folks in New York will tell you, they paid for it, they underwrite the costs of the meetings, and then you have very different conversations in terms of perception with RGGI if you're in Concord, New Hampshire, Augusta, Maine, as opposed to Albany. Is New York the 900-pound gorilla, and what is that degree of power balance? And what would happen if Pennsylvania, which is an observer in the RGGI process, and generates almost double the greenhouse gas emissions of New York, were to jump in, and New York would no longer be the dominant player? Or relationships with existing regional organizations and entities in New England that for decades have dealt with these kinds of issues. So there's a certain fragility to much of this. The last point I simply want to touch upon, and maybe a little more consistent with the theme of the conference, is I continue to be struck how, with a few exceptions, and here I would highlight Manitoba and Alberta for very different reasons, one has not seen at the Canadian provincial level anything approaching the kind of policy capacity development that we see in a large number of states. The position of Alberta has been very clear for some time. It has been hostile to Kyoto and trying to develop its own policy system and set of policy professionals that basically mimic the stance of the Bush administration. It's absolutely staggering to sit in an Alberta environment, the lead energy agency, and be in US EPA and see basically the same policies, the same language, the same positions, and the emphasis on voluntary programs. Manitoba is a little different, in part for reasons that were mentioned yesterday, because of the economic development opportunities they see from exporting hydro and the like. Well, at what point and to what extent can states and provinces begin to talk to one another? There are constitutional issues there. But if in fact this is an area where subnational policy is really going to be a significant driver, there needs to be robust, significant action. And as I mentioned in a passing comment to Stacy, and I'll make this my final comment, I find it intriguing that when one looks at RGGI, the conversations are not only among the 8 or 10 states that are active players, but as was mentioned, there's conversation with California, there's conversation with North Carolina, there's conversation with Oregon, there's regular conversation with Brussels and independent discussions with members of the European Union. Could you have some kind of a cap and trade program? What has been missing is Canadian participation. New Brunswick is an observer, but has only shown up at one of the most recent meetings. The other Canadian provinces, including Quebec, which is part of this formal partnership, the Eastern Canadian premiers and the New England governors, doesn't show up, doesn't participate. And I would argue those provinces, for the most part, don't have the capacity or the tradition of thinking about cap and trade programs for a variety of reasons. So one real challenge is all dimensions of intergovernmental, cross-state, cross-programmatic, cross-institutional, and this sort of awkward issue of how far can states and provinces go, given the fact that they're not national players. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Barry, for such a lucid presentation. We're going to turn now to Susie Moser.
Okay.
Get your microphone.
On the webcast won't hear you.
Oh, okay.
This. Absolutely. Thanks. So what I want to
do is actually take us all the way to sort of the grassroots for a number of reasons. In part because, of course, the citizenship as voters needs to support many of the activities that we talked about. There's also obviously the consumer sort of side of taking part in what business do, and you can often hear people in Congress or people in businesses saying, "I'm not going to start working on this until I feel there is a market signal, there is a political sort of signal from my constituency to support what people are maybe advocates are suggesting." What I'm presenting to you is actually the building on a 3-year project that I was co-leading with my colleague Lisa Dilling from the University of Colorado in Boulder. This project brought together, quite similar actually to this event, so it's a nice connection, scholars from multiple disciplines and practitioners, people who work in organizations, local governments, state governments, federal agencies, who basically are trying to communicate climate change to various people and are trying to create social change within their various entities. And so what I'm presenting to you is basically the conclusion and building on that conclusion from a multi-collaborator edited volume that's coming out at the end of this year. And I'll show you that one in a minute. Anyway, so here's what I want to talk about. So first of all, let's think a little bit what is the link between communication and civic action, and maybe dispel or expand some of the narrow notions that we have about these topics. And then, the title of this talk is about how do you use communication to mobilize. And so my sort of underlying assumption here is that in order to mobilize, you first have to understand why are they not engaged yet? What do we need to address for them to take part in any civic action? We'll speak more generally in terms of the roles that communication could play, and then actually turn to very concrete strategies, or maybe what you could call best practices that we have developed from this multi-collaborator project from all types of sectors and scales in society. So what is this link? Let's think about, this is sort of our common way of thinking about communication. Disseminate information, get the flyers out, get others to understand the issue. Among scientists, this is one of the favorite things. If you don't act on climate change, you must obviously not understand. Let me fill this deficit in your brain, and then somehow you will be motivated to act. It's actually in psychology known as the deficit model, and it's been shown to not work. And I can go into great detail of why that's not the case, but anyway, that's one of them. Convince the public that the issue is real and that it's urgent. Those are typically things that many environmental advocacy groups pursue, and their favorite way of doing that, of course, is by making it more scary, right? I mean, the cover of Time magazine we all saw, Be Worried, Be Very Worried, is a good example of that. Again, there's an interesting sort of side of that, again, coming out of psychology. Fear appeals tend to produce two responses among the people who receive them. One is that you actually respond to that proactively by trying to reduce the danger control. That would be adaptive. That would be a constructive response to being, receiving one of those fear appeals. The other one is that you simply only control your fear because it's uncomfortable. And it's very often the case when you don't know what to do, when it's totally overwhelming, when you don't feel like you can do anything. And it's unfortunately often the case with climate change. So deficit model, fear appeals, very tricky places to go with communication, but that's typically what we have done. Now, let's just take this a step further. When you actually look at the linguistic root, and I'm sorry for being a little stickler for language here, but it comes from the same Latin root as the word communion, which suggests words like to impart, to share, to make common. Now that's a much broader sense or connotation than just getting my message across. And I will elaborate by saying the word common comes from the words together and public duties. That then connects it very nicely to civic action. If we think of civic actions as actions that not just are done as individuals for my own self-interest, but that are done in awareness of and in support of a common goal, a sort of public work that is done in public, by the public, of the public, for the public, very much a sort of very engaged form of democracy that sometimes one can think about, then that's the sort of thing where communication and a much wider sort of notion of communication that I will try to elaborate here could actually play an important role in facilitating civic action. So I want to make the argument here that if we tried harder and better, more effectively to communicate climate change, we actually have an opportunity, maybe in the most optimistic sense, of renewing civic engagement in American democracy. Now, you may think this is very idealistic and optimistic, and I'm not. And I would say yes, I am, and not because I think it's easy, not because I think this is going to be. There's no really strong currents that speak against that. But I'm optimistic, or I refuse to be pessimistic until we have tried better ways of communicating. So that's sort of my philosophical state on this. Now, in order to understand, how could we mobilize, how could we engage people? Again, I'm not making the argument that people some are not already engaged in the process. In fact, this whole conference illustrates how much activity there's already going on, and the same happens actually at the individual level, at the community level. The point is that I would say there's not a widespread civic engagement on climate change, no matter what the polls say about people's perception or attitudes, whatever. And so the question becomes, how can we get those that aren't involved? And to understand that, I think we need to look at the barriers that are in the way. Sorry that all this text comes up at once. The first one, I'll simply have 4 categories of barriers, and maybe it's a little arbitrary. I don't necessarily mean these to follow any logical sequence but I think there are important pieces we need to remember. And the first one, and I mention that first because people hear information first through their ears, but with their guts. Okay, people are not first rational thinkers. People first respond quite emotionally to information, and I can, if we want to, if we have time, I can go into more detail why I say that. But one of the things we tend to overlook is how people emotionally respond to information. I mentioned before the issue of fear appeals and sort of the overwhelming nature of this. The typical response you get if you ask anyone in this country, and probably it's the same in Canada and Europe or elsewhere, at least that's the kind of feedback I'm getting, is that people feel like, I feel like it's real, it's going on, it's probably partly human caused. If it's not already happening, it's going to happen soon, and be serious. But you know what? I'm just one small person, and I don't know how I could by changing my light bulbs, I don't know how I can possibly make a difference. So what they end up doing in that situation, I mentioned this with the fear appeals, people shut down. It's too overwhelming. They don't see how they can make a difference in this big problem. And so we need to actually be really, mindful of those types of responses. Oftentimes the language, the frames in which we talk about climate change just don't resonate, or they only resonate to some people but not to others. So we have engaged some, but to many people, I don't know, a greenhouse problem, an energy problem, a CO2 problem, that just doesn't ring very well with a lot of people. And so, it just doesn't resonate. So people are not connecting to the information that we might put out there. What the polls show again and again, and more intense research, is that while people sort of generally are aware now of the issue and they get that it's going on, when you ask them, so basically how does this work, you get pretty much blank faces very quickly. People, and I'm not saying we need to turn people into PhD climatologists, not at all. But one of the common things here is that people think of climate change as has something to do with the ozone hole. Why is it so? Well, because the thing that happens is the first global atmospheric problem people heard about was the ozone hole. And so they have this mental frame, there's this hole in the roof of the atmosphere and there's too much heat coming through and that's why it's heating up. And so what we need to do, of course, is stop using spray cans, right? So people have mental pictures in their mind of how climate change works, and if that is fundamentally wrong, then they don't know what to do about it. So we simply need to move to a place where they at least understand the very basics of the mechanism and what the causes are if we want to engage them in the right answers. the right solutions. A lot of people might simply disagree with or lack knowledge of what the actions and the solutions are, and here I would blame the scientific community and the NGO community quite a bit, in that we have so much emphasized that it's happening. We have so much emphasized this is a scientific issue, right? We have so much emphasized what the impacts might be, and then you don't get anyone to say, so what? What are we going to do? I mean, the typical problem is connected to the lack of understanding of the causal mechanism, that people don't know what to do because we haven't talked about it enough. So you get people getting the reality and the urgency, or at least beginning to get the urgency of this issue, and then they get scared and they want to do something, and then they often, from scientists who are the many key communicators in this area, have simply not offered them answers. The issue of how bad it could get. I mean, we so emphasize a dreary future in our communication. Why would anyone want to be part of this? I mean, it's going to get too hot. There's going to be health issues. There's going to be bad economic impacts. All the species are going to go, worse storms. I mean, it's not a pretty picture. And I just want to maybe provocatively say slavery didn't get finished, or didn't get sort of tackled on the notion of how bad slavery is. It got tackled because people had a vision of freedom. In the same way, what is the vision that we're putting forward to people that is worth fighting for? It's much more interesting and much more sustaining to engage in something that has a positive outcome than in something that's just avoiding the worst. Okay, next one. Social barriers. People are actually social beings. We tend to forget that, which means they're parents. They have job responsibilities. They have a particular social identity. And if you're proposing to them something that they should do that conflicts with their obligation, that conflicts with who they want to be in the world, they will not do it. It is a primary motivation of how people are in the world, how they fit into their social context. It matters much more what my peers think of me than someone I don't know, or that it's good for the planet or whatever. If my identity is not connected to that good outcome, then what's more important is that my friends still like me tomorrow. So this is a really deeply important issue, and I think there's actually opportunity in that. If we can link actions to that, they will support or at least not contradict who you want to be in the world, you're going to be much more likely to succeed. Taking on an identity, for example, taking part in a social movement that has sort of a stigma attached to it that doesn't, again, fit with your social identity, you're much less likely to participate in that. Social norms. One of the things we keep saying, and it's sort of counterintuitive, by reiterating all the bad behaviors that emit, that use up too much energy. By doing that, we actually suggest to people, well, it's still very common practice. It's okay to do that. Instead of suggesting what are the preferred social norms that guide our behavior, again, it's the issue of, what do we want to promote in the world. We move on to the next one. For civic engagement, you're going to face the additional issue that, how people feel about the political process. And one of them, of course, is that many are disinterested, and it connects with their sense of disenfranchisement from the political process, and would rather leave political activism to somebody else. It takes time, it takes resources, it's inconvenient. You are going to be out there on the front line. It's not necessarily comfortable sort of place to be, unless you're sort of, by nature very much interested in being an activist or being out in public with your actions. And so one of the challenges here is that, we need to actually help people see that their actions could have an impact in the larger civic environment, not just for their own personal, interests or for their very narrow environment, but for a larger good. And I think that's a very challenging one that at least current communication on climate change does not address very well at all. Believe in existing institutions. As long as you think that somebody is going to still take care of this, government's going to do it, Congress is going to come around, or simply transfer responsibility for this on someone else. The experts are going to find a solution. Well, as long as you think that, why should you take action? So one of the tasks of a communicator is to help show how the existing institutions or actors do not do enough of the job, right? Well, I'm not sure. We're doing some of this, but I don't think we're connecting this very effectively with what people could do instead. The traditionalist views, what I mean by that is, I've always done it that way. I don't want to change. That's the sort of idea of, just sticking with what's going on already. Other structural barriers. Let's just assume for a minute you could overcome the psychological, social, and political barriers. You might still actually fail to get anyone to do something because they simply face some structural barriers that undermine any activity. For example, if you want to get people involved and say, well, take public transportation, but there isn't any. You give them all the reasons why they should get out of their cars, but then they don't really have a feasible alternative. I just give you the very quick example that if I were to take the bus from my house, which is 3.5 miles from my workplace, it would take me an hour and a half. It takes, 15 minutes, whatever, to drive, 20 to bike. So what am I going to do? In winter especially, I don't think I'm going to take the bus and spend all that time. Anyway, there's laws, regulation, institutions, we heard that a lot yesterday, that undermine people taking innovative actions. And they're not only sort of directed at the business community or at insurance industry, but very much also toward individuals. This is the issue of vested interests controlling political and electoral processes and institutions. So that which goes very much together with this idea of disenfranchisement from the political process. Lots of people just don't see that, even going to vote or voting for a different candidate will make a difference given how things are. I want to mention a couple of things here that have to do with the communication channels per se. We see a growing trend of concentration of media industry ownership, and that means that the diversity of views, one could argue, is diminishing. That means people don't get a very wide variety of views on the issue of climate change, what one might do. To discuss in this sort of political economy a very complex issue like climate change is exceedingly difficult. If you get 3 minutes, I'm moving on. Okay. One very important issue that I just want to point out is that one of the sort of out of the structural context of our lives and also the communication issues that we live actually in what are termed homophilous groups, and what that means is like in groups that are actually internally quite homogenous. And so one of the biggest issues for communication and to spread an idea is that you need to overcome social divides in order to spread your message to areas or to people that have not yet been involved. And so this one actually is quite a challenging one to overcome. So let me just, whoops. Let me move on to this thing. If there's nothing else you hear, this would be the important piece. In order then for communication to actually achieve a particular desired social change, in this case, getting people to engage civically on this issue, you first of all have to give people a really good reason why they should do that. This is actually quite a challenging issue to achieve just because, we are all creatures of habit. To overcome our sort of, why we do things the way we do, to motivate people to do something different is that needs to be tackled and not effectively so far. At the same time, we have to at least address in our communication and maybe redirect our campaigns of communication in a way that lowers the barriers to actually making the change. If you don't achieve both, then you will not achieve a social change or civic action with your communication efforts. On each one, I have on each of these 4 issues how to communicate better, how to raise motivation, lower barriers, and where to focus social change efforts. I have slides, so I'm going to go through these very quickly here. The point of this is simply that a one-size communication effort will not fit all. The types of people that are just sort of depicted here, you can sort of, use these as stereotypical types of populations. They have very different concerns, very different understandings, very different opportunities and barriers that they face. And if you want to have a particular change, you need to pick the people who can actually make the change, important, leverage point, understand how they think about the issue and address your communication effort toward that particular audience. Match the message with and content with the language that works. Make the issue local. And by that, I don't mean just local in a geographic sense, but local in what matters to this type of population. Okay? Make it salient to them. This one, very challenging for scientists. We love to couch everything we have to say in all these ways of buffering our uncertainties about things. You should never represent the degree of confidence in the scientific understanding, but simply turn it around. Say what you're confident about first, because otherwise you simply give people an out. If you spend 50 minutes saying what we don't know, and then say your important thing last, they have long checked out. So leading with certainty and then people are actually quite willing to hear counter to current belief what's left uncertain. We have convinced people on the science. That's no longer the issue. And by that, again, I don't mean we have made people into deeply understanding atmospheric scientists, but we have simply convinced them that the issue is real enough that we need to worry about it. PLUs, people like us. That goes back to the issue of the homophilous groups. If you want to cross over to a group that you're not part of, you need to use messengers that have standing and are trusted in the community in which you want to reach into, right? Most communities actually would rather take information from those that are like them rather than from someone who doesn't know anything about their lives, their way of thinking and being. Okay, I will move on just in the interest of time. What motivates people varies a lot. The issue of greater understanding and knowledge is often maybe a necessary but never a sufficient condition for anyone to change the issue. And the simple reason is that most people are not the experts on climate change. So they're very vulnerable on, oh, this expert said this. Well, that sounds reasonable. Oh, this expert says the contrary. Well, that sounds reasonable too. People can't evaluate that. And you can't convince them persistently on knowledge alone in an expert area, and in a very exclusionary area. So what we need to do is connect this issue with the deeper issues, where everyone is an expert on, who they want to be in the world, what they value. So this is where we need to go, connect it to identity. For some, it's going to be whether or not they're going to be elected next time. And the positive vision, I mentioned that. Maybe the biggest thing to break through is this one. The disinterest and apathy, and I would suggest that the way to do that is to surprise people. If every single message they hear about climate change is just like every other one that they've already heard, well, sorry, there's a more important channel on TV that they can go to. They just don't want to hear another one. If it comes always from the same kinds of people that say it, well, surprise them. Use music, use art, use something, humor, for heaven's sake. Use something very different. Trying to think of climate change action in the context of social support. This is the issue of everyone goes to AA because it's a lot easier to break a habit when you're in social context, when you have accountability, when you have support, when you have people who tell you what they did in a difficult situation. It's the same thing here. We have a habit, or as someone said, an addiction to climate, to energy. So maybe we need that kind of same approach. What we've heard here is that there's actually no one scale or sector in which activity is happening, and there's important ways in which what happens at the local level and the individual level influences what happens at other levels. I would say one of the most interesting things happening in American society today is what happens at the interfaces of different sectors. The investors working with the faith community, the scientists working with the environmentalists, the faith community working with the economists, whatever. So let's see. I'll just stop with this last slide here. It is central and instrumental, actually, in civic engagement, how we talk about the issue. And as I said, I think it could play, if we think more deeply about the type of what kind of future we want, how to engage in it, i.e. often in small groups, then we could actually have a very different type of democracy in this country. Who we talk to should be chosen very carefully and strategically, because then you can tailor your communication toward that. Most communicators that have been playing big roles in the past don't know at all how to do that and don't understand the communication process, and I think we need to pay some attention to actually helping people make that more effective. The idea of let's just give them information is just not working. we need to move to an engaging dialogue because it is a question about what kind of future do we want. And for that question, scientists or NGOs are not the privileged only ones that can lead that discussion. So I mentioned this, and big emphasis on the visioning of a positive future. This is the book that's coming out, and you can get a lot of case studies and sort of academic insights into any of these aspects that I just sort of ran through now. So sorry for running over.
Terrific, Susie. Thanks so much. When is the book coming out?
End of this year.
End of this year. Okay, terrific. We'll look for that. And I think it really does behoove those of us on the scientific and research and analytical side to listen very closely to these messages, because way too often we say, here's our book, derive all the policy conclusions and actions from it. Go home, here's your reading assignment. And we don't do nearly enough in terms of thinking about how people receive messages and receive information. So thank you very much, Susie. Andrew, we'll turn the floor over to you.
Great, thank you. I wanted to say thanks to Stacy and Henrik, the center, and everyone here for putting on this conference. It's nice to participate in this. I read Barry and Susie's papers this week, and as I read them, I found myself actually sort of filtering all these ideas through the lens of whether or not, in Barry's case, state policy development and diffusion, and in Susie's case, communication and civic action, can actually be key drivers to solving global climate change. And I have a specific idea in mind when I say solving global climate change. I'm really getting at technology shifts. And that's not to give short shrift to things like conservation and urban planning and building architecture, which are perhaps important parts of the solution as well. But when you look at emissions and the way emissions need to change globally, I think it's fair to say that technology is really at the center of this, and specifically technology shifts for transport and power generation. And there's a lot of discussion today about state climate policy and also civic action, and I think, frankly, the reason we are focusing so much on this is because of the impasses that we see at the international level and the federal level. And if we were seeing a lot of progress there, well, then maybe these other areas wouldn't be quite so important. But it's interesting to ask the question, could the international dialogues and federal government action become obsolete or irrelevant? Could we actually solve global climate change with state policy and civic action? And since Susie went last, I'll actually pick up with a few of my observations on communication and civic action, and then I'll try to revert back to the state policy stuff at the end. I'm skeptical that civic action actually is the answer. There's a joke about climate change that it's like yelling termites in a crowded theater. And the joke is that it makes people uncomfortable, but it doesn't actually get them out of their seats and taking action and sort of heading for the exits. And there are reasons why that. I think Susie touched on a number of them, and I think it'd be a really interesting exercise if we went around this table and asked everyone here, an audience that probably knows a lot more about this issue than the average man on the street, what are you doing in your personal life or in your business, in your office space, to deal with climate change? And we're not going to, I don't think we have time to do that. I wouldn't want to embarrass anybody. I'll embarrass myself by speaking for myself. I know a lot about this issue, and probably, I focus on electricity conservation in my home. I take public transportation, but there are probably dozens of additional things I could be doing that I don't do. So even I am victim to apathy and sort of behavioral inertia. I would like to put in a plug for my employer, the World Resources Institute, which does a really terrific job on this. And every year my institute tracks our greenhouse gas emissions associated with our energy consumption and employee commuting. And we buy offsets in renewable energy to actually offset the greenhouse gas emissions associated with our institute. And we publish all that information on our website if you'd like to see how we do it. So I am a bit of a skeptic about civic action, but I think it's fair to say the more the better. And it would be great if we could increase it. And I want to pick up on some of the points that Susie raised and sort of give I've worked on climate change now for a number of years, and I'd like to give you a few of my impressions about communication and how we might be able to ramp up civic action. First of all, and Susie mentioned this, you need to focus on solutions. The public can't pursue this issue as something that involves scary weather. The scariness becomes debilitating, and if it's weather, then it's just an act of God, and we can't do anything about it. You need to focus on the idea that climate change is a man-made problem and there are man-made solutions. And I would like to say that a number of national environmental groups here in the United States who are some of the key communicators on this issue picked up on this several years ago. And if you look at the campaigns being launched right now by groups like Environmental Defense or the World Wildlife Fund, it's pretty clear that they're focusing on solutions-oriented public communication campaigns, which is a good thing. We certainly need better language. The comedian Bill Maher has a joke about global warming that no word is warmer than warming. It sounds like we're all going to a spa together. Sort of the punchline to his joke is that we ought to call it something scary like climatia. It's funny. I've heard a million suggestions about how do we change away from these words climate change and global warming and come up with something that resonates with the public and the public's values. I've heard things like global destabilization, the carbon blanket. I have no idea what works. I'm waiting for somebody like Susie to tell me what to do. Thank you. Yeah, we can catch up on the break. Another issue, scientists who are very important communicators on this issue always speak in probabilities, statistical probabilities. That's what they do. That's why they're scientists. And that actually puts them at a disadvantage, particularly because there are a lot of people who are motivated against this issue. And you have contrarians who go to the public and speak in absolute certainties, which is terribly annoying. But there are people who have agendas. There's a lot of money at stake in the outcome of policy on this issue. And you have people who are deliberately trying to conflate things and confuse the public. And they never actually would tell the public that there is a chance that you could have 8 or 10 degree Fahrenheit warming in the 21st century. They will tell the public with absolute certainty that there's no problem here. Which actually puts us at a bit of a disadvantage, I think, for people who truly do understand the scientific side of this issue. And then, of course, this plays right into the kind of rigid sort of two sides of the argument template that the mainstream news media uses when presenting this issue. I don't know exactly what the solution to that is, but clearly we need to find a way around it. I know that part of it is dealing with uncertainties and how you communicate statistical uncertainties. My own thought on this is that there are uncertainties with how climate change is going to play out, but where the uncertainties exist, it's irrelevant to the policymaking dialogue. And I have an analogy for that, and there's another great threat in the 21st century, which is nuclear terrorism. And nobody knows when a nuclear terrorist bomb would go off or how many would go off, where it would go off, who would launch it, what the cost would be, what the destruction would be. You could say there's a great deal of uncertainty about whether or not nuclear terrorism is a serious threat and we should be responding to it. But we understand the causal linkages that create this threat. We understand that there's materials that can be used, there are bombs that can be made, and there are people who would use them. And therefore we worry about this, and we spend tens of billions of dollars a year here in the United States and globally to deal with this risk and deal with this threat, even though there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And with climate change, we don't know exactly how much warming is going to take place or where the impacts are going to fall and how those costs will manifest themselves. But that is no reason for inaction. So where uncertainty exists and where we have some scientific questions that we don't have perfect answers to, I think it's irrelevant in the public policy debate. So if we could just figure out how to put that on a bumper sticker and communicate it to the public, we're fine. Just lastly, a couple of points about communication, and I'd like to get over to state policy development and diffusion. I think there's been talk about linking climate change to other public policy issues that people care about, like energy security. I think that in energy security that's actually problematic because the two can work against each other, although not necessarily. I actually much prefer linking climate change to the issue of technology job creation and the positioning of the U.S. economy in a global economy where basically the U.S. competes in a space where we develop and innovate new products and services, and the older sort of industries of textiles and the like are really basically we don't compete in that area anymore. So I think there is a natural synergy between how we position the U.S. economy, or any industrial economy for that matter, with solving global climate change. A point that Susie made about having a positive outcome, I think that's very important. You do have to communicate that. Essay a couple of years back called Death of Environmentalism created a lot of controversy in the environmental community, but one of the great points in that essay, and I commend it to people, was imagine if Martin Luther King's speech, the I Have a Dream speech, was actually titled I Have a Nightmare. It wouldn't have been nearly as compelling. You have to have a positive vision. And lastly, on communication, I believe that the way you're going to get civic action on this, the way you're going to get people out of their seats and taking action, is by framing this as a moral issue. This isn't a pocketbook issue. This is akin to the civil rights movement. People were marching in the streets because they saw civil rights as a values issue and something that really defined the values of our society. With climate change, I would ask somebody, would you actually, take food out of your child's mouth and take it for yourself if you were hungry? And most people would say no, and that's because of their values. And right now, the current generations are essentially, taking away from their children, their grandchildren. I think that's a moral issue, and I think that's how you get people activated on climate change. So let's go back then to Barry's presentation, state climate policy development and diffusion. And again, I want to cast it through this lens of solving global climate change. Can state climate policy development get us to the technology shifts in transport and power generation technologies that ultimately might make federal and international policy irrelevant or obsolete? And I'd like to say in particular, in this concept of technology shifts, it's very critical that some of the cutting edge technologies that can do a lot of heavy lifting in reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, I'm referring to things like integrated gasification combined cycle with carbon capture and storage, cellulosic ethanol, plug-in hybrid vehicles, some renewable energy technologies, maybe new nuclear reactor designs. A lot of these technologies are moving beyond R&D. They're very close to commercialization, but the magic threshold here is when the new technology on a per unit cost or the operational marginal cost actually is more cost effective than the status quo older generation technologies. That's the sort of magic point that we're driving to. Can we just push the technology to that threshold and then allow market forces and basically rational economic decisions take over and begin pulling the technologies, hopefully at a rate fast enough that we'll be able to make large-scale reductions within the next 30, 40, 50 years. So I'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to get back to state policy development. Can the states by themselves get us to these thresholds? And I think